Snow crunched under heavy boots as the mountain man dropped a bloody wolf carcass on the porch. The silent challenge to the trembling woman inside. 5 male order brides had already taken one look at Silas Montgomery, at his scarred face and blood-stained hands, packed their velvet trunks, and fled down the bitter mountains crying. No woman lasted a week. They called him half grizzly, half ghost. Then came Clementine. She didn't run from his silence. She didn't faint at the sight of blood. She just rolled up her sleeves, dusted her thick hands with flour, and showed him what survival truly meant. The town of Oak Haven, Wyoming territory was little more than a muddy collection of timber buildings huddled against the jagged teeth of the mountains. It was the fall of 1881, and the autumn wind already carried the biting promise of ice. Inside the post office, Jedediah Cobb, a man whose face was as wrinkled as a dried apple, stamped a piece of mail with far more force than necessary. He was furious, and for good reason. Silas Montgomery had sent back another one. "I'm telling you, Jedediah, the man is cursed," whispered Mrs. Abernathy, adjusting her woolen shawl as she peered through the frost-rimmed window. "That's 5 girls this year. 5. Clara Miller made it 3 days before she came running down that mountain with her petticoats torn, swearing she'd seen the devil himself. Josephine Wright lasted 5, but only because a storm washed out the trail." Jeddy sighed, rubbing his temples. "Silas ain't the devil, Martha. He's just particular and deeply univilized." Silas Montgomery was a name that commanded both respect and deep-seated fear in Oak Haven. Standing 6'4", with shoulders broad enough to block out the sun, he lived entirely isolated up on Dead Man's Ridge. A brutal grizzly attack years prior had left a jagged white scar tearing down the left side of his face, blinding him in one eye and leaving him with a permanent, terrifying scowl. He traded pelts and gold dust for supplies twice a year, rarely speaking more than 3 syllables to anyone. Yet he kept paying Jedediah exorbitant fees to place advertisements in Eastern newspapers for a wife. Silas didn't want a companion. He wanted a pioneer. He wanted someone to keep the hearth burning, tend the garden, and preserve the meat while he hunted. But every woman who arrived expecting a romantic frontiersman found a silent, brooding giant who lived in a drafty, blood-smelling cabin. They all left. Within a week, without a fail, the stagecoach rumbled into town, its wooden wheels throwing up clouds of frozen mud. Jedediah groaned. "Lord help me. The 6th one is here." The door of the coach swung open, and the townspeople gathered to watch the next victim step out. They expected another fragile, wide-eyed girl in a corseted silk dress. Trembling like a leaf, instead outstepped Clementine Hughes. The suspension of the stagecoach groaned audibly as she descended. Clementine was a woman of substantial carriage, where the other brides had been willowy and delicate. Clementine was broad, thick-waisted, and heavy-set. She wore a simple dark brown traveling dress of heavy wool, devoid of lace or frivolity. Her face was round, her cheeks flushed pink from the cold, and her dark hair was pulled back into a severe, practical bun. She didn't look around with the terrified awe of a city girl. She looked around with the weary, assessing gaze of a woman who had already seen the worst the world had to offer. "Mr. Cobb," her voice was steady, resonant, and entirely lacking in the frantic pitch Jedediah had grown accustomed to. "That would be me, Miss Hughes," Jedediah said, stepping off the porch. He looked at her, his heart sinking. He meant no disrespect, but life on Dead Man's Ridge was brutal, even for the fittest of men. Silas was going to be furious. "I reckon I should warn you right now. Mr. Montgomery is well. He's a hard man. The trail up to his cabin is rough, and his manners are rougher. I did not travel 2,000 miles from Boston for manners, Mr. Cobb," Clementine said flatly, adjusting her grip on her heavy canvas satchel. "I came for a roof, a stove, and a legal name change. Where is he?" As if summoned by the sheer weight of her determination, the crowd parted. Silas Montgomery stood at the edge of the street, flanked by 2 massive pack mules. He wore a heavy bear-skin coat that made him look twice his size, his scarred face partially hidden beneath the brim of a weathered stance. Silas stared at Clementine, his one good eye swept over her heavy frame, taking in her stout stature and the plainness of her features. It didn't mask his profound disappointment. His jaw tightened, the muscles rippling under his thick beard. "You're the baker," Silas growled. His voice sounded like two stones grinding together. "I am," Clementine replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. "And you're the man who scares away women for sport." A murmur rippled through the onlookers. No one spoke to the mountain man that way. Silas's eye narrowed. He spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the frozen dirt, turned on his heel, and walked toward his mules. "Get your bags in the wagon," he threw over his shoulder. "If you can't lift 'em, you can get back on the coach." It was his first test. Clementine didn't ask for help. She walked to the back of the stagecoach, grabbed the handles of her heavy trunk, a trunk the driver had struggled to load, and hauled it out with a grunt of exertion. Her face burned red, sweat trickling down the back of her neck, but she dragged it across the mud and heaved it into the back of Silas's wagon. Silas watched her from the corner of his eye, his expression unreadable. She won't last 3 days, he thought. She's too heavy for the mountain, too slow for the work. The cold will break her by Wednesday. Without a word of welcome, he cracked the reins, and the wagon lurched forward, beginning the treacherous bone-rattling ascent toward Dead Man's Ridge. The wagon ride took 6 agonizing hours. The trail was little more than a deer path whitened by decades of wagon wheels, flanked on one side by a sheer cliff of jagged granite, and on the other by an endless drop into a valley of black pines. Silas drove recklessly, intentionally hitting deep ruts and exposed roots. It was his signature move, the initiation. Usually by the second hour the women were weeping, begging him to slow down, clutching his arm in terror. Clementine sat on the wooden bench, gripping the edge until her knuckles turned white, her heavy body absorbing the brutal impacts. She bit her lip so hard she tasted blood, but she did not utter a single sound. When a particularly violent jolt nearly threw her from the seat, she simply righted herself, smoothed her skirts, and stared straight ahead. When they finally broke through the tree and the cabin came into view, it was a rugged, squat structure built of massive, unpeeled pine logs. The roof was covered in soot, and a thin wisp of smoke curled from the stone chimney. Scattered around the yard were animal traps, stretched hides curing in the freezing air, and the rusted skeletal remains of an old plow. "We're here," Silas grunted, pulling back on the reins. He jumped down, unhitched the mules, and walked towards the barn, leaving her sitting alone in the gathering dusk. Clementine climbed down, her legs trembling from the cold and the arduous journey. She dragged her trunk into the cabin. The inside was exactly as she had feared. It smelled sharply of damp earth, old blood, and unwashed wool. The floor was packed dirt, swept but stained. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, but the fire had burned down to meager embers. A single cot lay in the corner, alongside a crude wooden table and a rusted iron cook stove that looked as though it hadn't been used for anything but boiling coffee in years. It was a bachelor's desolate cave. It was meant to be intimidating. When Silas finally came inside an hour later, the cabin was pitch black. He struck a match, expecting to find Clementine huddled in the corner, weeping into her hands like Clara had, or screaming about the smell of the hides like Josephine. Instead, the match flared to reveal Clementine standing by the iron stove, her sleeves rolled up past her thick elbows. She had already hauled water from the frozen creek, scrubbed the rusted top of the stove with sand, and got a roaring fire going. "Where do you keep your flour?" she asked, her voice cutting through the heavy silence. Silas blinked, momentarily taken aback. Pantry box under the floorboards. For the next 4 days, a silent psychological war waged inside the walls of the cabin. Silas was determined to freeze her out. He refused to speak to her unless absolutely necessary. He brought his muddy, snow-caked boots in sight and tracked them across the floor. Or she had just scrubbed. He would leave before dawn to check his trap lines, purposefully neglecting to chop the day's firewood, expecting her to freeze in his absence. But Clementine did not break. Where other women had seen malice, she only saw a man throwing a childish tantrum. On the morning of the 3rd day, she woke to a freezing cabin. The woodbox was entirely empty. Silas had been gone for hours. Clementine wrapped herself in a heavy woolen shawl, marched out to the woodpile, and picked up the heavy, splitting axe. She was not a lumberjack, but years of hauling 50 lb sacks of flour in a Boston bakery had given her thick, powerful arms and a sturdy foundation. For 2 hours she swung the axe, her lungs burned in the thin mountain air. Her hands blistered and bled, and sweat soaked through her undergarments, freezing against her skin. When Silas returned at dusk, expecting a shivering, defeated woman, begging to be taken back to town, he found the cabin sweltering hot. The smell of old blood and wet fur had been entirely eradicated, replaced by the intoxicating, rich aroma of yeast, roasted venison, and wild garlic. Clementine stood at the table, kneading a massive mound of sourdough with rhythmic, powerful thrusts of her heavy shoulders. She didn't even look up as he walked in. "Wipe your boots, Mr. Montgomery," she said evenly, "or you'll be eating your supper on the porch." Silas froze. He looked down at his boots, then at the steaming loaf of bread sitting on the table, its crust perfectly golden and crackling. His stomach gave a violent, traitorous rumble. Slowly, almost subconsciously, he kicked his boots against the doorframe, knocking the snow loose. He sat at the table in silence and ate. It was the best meal he had consumed in 10 years. But his pride was a stubborn, wounded thing. As he chewed, he blared at her. "She's putting on a show," he told himself. Day 7. They always break on day 7. To accelerate the process, on the morning of the 6th day, Silas returned from a hunt and threw the freshly skinned, bloody carcass of a mountain lion directly onto the kitchen floor, right next to where Clementine was sweeping. "Needs butchering," he grunted, crossing his arms, waiting for the scream. Clementine stared at the bloody mess. She leaned her broom against the wall. She looked at the carcass, then looked up at Silas, her dark eyes flashing with a sudden, terrifying intensity. "Silas Montgomery," she said, stepping toward him. She was much shorter than him, but in that moment she seemed to take up the entire room. "I have crossed an entire country. I have scrubbed a decade of filth from your floor. I have chopped your wood, cooked your food, and tolerated your miserable, brooding silence. If you ever disrespect my kitchen by throwing a bloody corpse on my clean floor again, I will take that cast-iron skillet and beat you senseless with it. Do you understand me?" Silas stared at her. His jaw went slack. For the first time in his life, the fearsome mountain man of Dead Man's Ridge took a step back. "I'll butcher it in the shed," he muttered, bending down and dragging the carcass back out the door. As the door clicked shut, Clementine finally let out a shaky breath, her knees trembling slightly. She had won the battle, but the 7th day was tomorrow, and the sky outside was turning a bruising, violent shade of purple. The real test was about to begin. The 7th day dawned not with sunlight but with a screaming, blinding wall of white. An early winter blizzard had swept down from the Canadian Rockies, slamming into the Bitterroot Range with hurricane-force winds. The temperature plummeted so fast that the sap in the pine trees froze and snapped with sounds like gunshot. Silas had been caught 3 miles from the cabin checking a distant trap line when the whiteout hit. It took him 6 grueling hours to fight his way back. He was nearly frostbitten, his beard caked in ice, his muscles screaming in agony as he blindly navigated by memory alone. As he finally saw the faint orange glow of the cabin window through the swirling snow, a sudden unfamiliar pang of guilt hit his chest. The wood, he thought in a panic. He had intentionally left the wood box half empty again that morning. In this cold, the cabin would be a tomb. The heavy baker woman would be dead, frozen in her bed, and it would be his fault. He threw his shoulder against the heavy oak door, bursting into the cabin along with a violent gust of snow. "Clementine," he roared over the wind, slamming the door shut behind him. The cabin was warm, not sweltering, but fiercely defended against the cold. The fire was banked perfectly, burning slow and hot. But the cabin was in disarray. Clementine was sitting on the floor, surrounded by a sea of scattered papers, ledgers, and open letters. Beside her, her heavy cedar trunk lay on its side, the lock violently smashed open. She held a heavy iron poker in her hand, her chest heaving, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and fury. Silas shook the ice from his coat, his hand instinctively dropping to the hunting knife at his belt. "What happened? Did someone break in?" "No," Clementine said, her voice shaking as she lowered the poker. "The wind. It blew the shutters open. The latch broke. The wind knocked the trunk over and it smashed against the hearth." Silas walked closer, his boots dripping melting snow onto the floor. He looked down at the scattered papers. He might have been a recluse, but he wasn't illiterate. His sharp eye caught the bold, terrifying letterhead printed on several of the documents. Gideon Blackwood and Company, Transcontinental Railroad Enterprises, Chicago, Illinois. Pinkerton National Detective Agency. Warrant for apprehension. Silas froze. He knelt down, his massive hand scooping up a crumpled telegraph. He read it aloud, his gruff voice cutting through the crackling of the fire. Target is a female, Clementine Hughes, wanted for embezzlement, fraud, and the theft of $40,000 in railroad bonds. Armed and dangerous. Bounty, $5,000 a lie. Silas looked up at her, his scarred face twisting in disbelief. He looked at her flour-dusted apron, her thick, flowery hands, her flushed, round face. "You," Silas breathed, "you stole $40,000 from Gideon Blackwood." Blackwood owns half the judges in the territory. He's a ruthless butcher. Clementine didn't cry. She didn't beg. She simply pulled herself up from the floor, smoothing her skirts with trembling hands, her chin lifting in defiance. "I didn't steal it," she said, her voice hard as iron. "My brother did. Thomas was a clerk for Blackwood. He got in over his head with gambling debts. He forged my signature on the transfer documents to frame me, took the money, and fled to Mexico. Blackwood doesn't care about the truth. He only cares about a culprit. The Pinkertons came to the bakery. They threatened to burn it down with me inside." She looked away, staring into the flames. "I saw your advertisement in the Boston Globe, seeking a strong, silent woman for permanent residence in the deep, isolated Bitterroot Mountains. Must be willing to sever old ties. It wasn't a marriage proposal, Mr. Montgomery. To me it was a hiding place." Silas stood up slowly, dwarfing her in the small cabin. The wind howled outside, rattling the thick log walls. The previous 5 brides had left because they were afraid of the dark, afraid of the silence, afraid of him. But Clementine wasn't afraid of the mountain. She was terrified of what was climbing it. "A week," Silas said softly, almost to himself. "You stayed a week, because if you go back down that mountain, they'll hang you." "Yes," Clementine said, her dark eyes locking onto his. "I have nowhere else to go." "You wanted a pioneer, Silas. You wanted someone who wouldn't run away. Well, congratulations, I can't leave. So you can either turn me over to the sheriff in Oak Haven for the bounty, or you can sit down and eat the damn stew I made before it gets cold." Silas stared at the heavy, stubborn woman standing in front of his fire. He looked at her blistered hands, the calluses forming from his axe, and the fiercely proud set of her jaw. He thought of the 5 fragile women who had run from his scars, and then he looked at the woman who had just threatened him with a skittit yesterday. A slow, strange sound rumbled in Silas's chest. It took Clementine a moment to realize what it was. The mountain man was laughing. It was a rusty, grating sound, like an old engine turning over, but it was genuine. Silas shook his head, tossing the Pinkerton warrant into the roaring fire. He watched the paper curl and burn into ash. "Blackwood's men won't make it up Dead Man's Ridge in the winter," Silas said, walking past her towards the table. "They'd freeze before they hit the tree line, and if they come in the spring." He pulled out his chair and sat down, his good eye gleaming with a dangerous protective light. "We'll bury them in the valley." He picked up his spoon past the salt wife. The winter of 1881 did not merely fall upon the Bitter Mountains. It imprisoned them. For 5 months, the cabin on Dead Man's Ridge was cut off from the rest of the Wyoming territory by snowdrifts 10 feet high. The world shrank to the size of a single room, lit by the erratic glow of the hearth and smelling of wood smoke, curing leather and yeast. In that profound isolation, the silence between Silas Montgomery and Clementine Hughes slowly transformed. It stopped being a weapon and became a sanctuary. There was no sudden, fiery romance. The frontier did not allow for such soft luxuries. Instead, their bond was forged in the brutal, exhausting crucible of survival. Silas would rise before dawn, braving temperatures that could snap a pine branch like glass to clear the chimney and check the snares set close to the cabin. When he returned, half frozen and coated in a rime of white frost, a basin of steaming water and a plate of hot, thick, crusted sourdough and fried venison were waiting for him. Clementine never coddled him, and she never once looked away from the horrific, jagged scar that ruined the left side of his face. To her, it was simply a map of a battle he had won. In return, Silas began to show his gratitude in the only language he knew. When Clementine's heavier leather boots began to wear thin, she woke to find them meticulously resoled with thick, waterproof bear hide. When she struggled to reach the highest shelf in the pantry, A sturdy hand-carved cedar step stool quietly appeared beside it the next morning. By January, the psychological war was entirely over. They sat by the fire in the evenings, Silas oiling his Winchester rifle or mending traps, Clementine aggressively knitting heavy wool socks or reading from a battered copy of the old curiosity shop she had brought from Boston. He liked the sound of her voice. It was resonant and grounded, utterly devoid of the frantic bird-like fluttering he had despised in the other women. "You never asked about the bear," Clementine stated one late February evening, not looking up from her knitting needles. Silas paused, his oily rag hovering over the barrel of his rifle. He touched his ruined cheek. "Most women scream when they see it. The ones who don't ask about it in the first hour, morbidly curious, like looking at a freak show in a traveling circus. I am not most women, Silas. I have seen butchers in Boston with missing fingers and bakers with burn scars covering their arms. A man who fights a grizzly and lives is a man who intends to keep breathing. I like a man who intends to keep breathing." Silas looked at her heavy, solid frame illuminated by the firelight. The fire caught the warm, earthy tones of her brown hair. He realized with a sudden jarring clarity that he no longer saw her as plain. He saw her as the anchor holding his life to the earth. "It was 3 years ago," Silas rasped, staring into the flames. "A sow defending a cub I didn't see. She took me down in the heavy brush near Hangman's Creek, tore my face open, took my eye. I killed her with a hunting knife while she had her jaws around my collarbone. Bled out in the snow for nearly 2 days before a Shoshone hunting party found me." Clementine stopped knitting. She stood up, walked over to his chair, and placed her thick, flour-dusted hand gently on his broad shoulder. It was the first time she had initiated physical contact. "You survived the bear, Silas Montgomery," she said softly. "We will survive, Gideon Blackwood." But the true test of that promise arrived with the April's thaw. When the ice finally broke, turning the mountain trails into treacherous rushing rivers of mud, Silas knew he had to make the journey down to Oak Haven. They were desperately low on salt, coffee, and ammunition. "I will be back in 3 days," Silas told her, hitching the mules to the wagon. He handed her a double-barreled shotgun. "Don't open the door for anyone, not even if they claim to be God Almighty. I have enough boiling water and lead for the devil himself." Silas just come back. The town of Oak Haven was bustling with the frantic energy of spring when Silas arrived. Men who had been trapped in logging camps for months were spending their wages in the saloons, and supply wagons were rolling in from the east. Silas parked his wagon behind Jedediah Cobb's general store and post office, keeping his sump pulled low. Jedediah nearly dropped a jar of pickled eggs when Silas walked in. "Lord above, Silas, you're alive!" Jedediah exclaimed, wiping his hands on his apron. "When you didn't come down in November, folks figured you'd frozen to death." Or he hesitated, lowering his voice. "Or that big Boston woman did you in?" "She's fine. We need supplies," Silas grunted, dropping a heavy leather pouch of gold dust and prime winter pelts onto the counter. 50 lb of flour, 20 of sugar, coffee, salt, and Silas paused, feeling a strange heat rise in his neck. "Do you have any yards of that blue calico fabric? The good stuff from Chicago, and a tin of lemon drops." Jedediah stared at him, his jaw slack. "Blue calico, lemon drops." "Silas, did that woman actually stay?" "Just fetch the goods, Jedediah." As Jedediah hurried to fill the massive order, the bell above the door jingled. 2 men walked in. The air in the store immediately shifted, turning sharp and metallic. Silas didn't need to turn around to know there were trouble. He could smell the stale cigar smoke, the expensive bay rum cologne, and the oiled leather of gun belts. "Afternoon, storekeeper," a smooth, cultured voice rang out. Silas shifted his weight, glancing out of the corner of his one good eye. The speaker was a tall man in a tailored charcoal suit that had no business being in a Wyoming mud town. He wore a bowler hat and a silver pocket watch chain. Beside him stood a shorter, deeply tanned man with a shotgun resting casually over his shoulder. "What can I do for you, gentlemen?" Jedediah asked, his voice trembling slightly. The tall man pulled a folded piece of paper from his breast pocket and smoothed it onto the counter right next to Silas's gold pouch. "My name is Agent Josiah Sterling," the man said smoothly. "Pinkerton National Detective Agency. I am operating on behalf of Mr. Cast. Gideon Blackwood. We are looking for a fugitive, a woman." Goes by the name Clementine Hughes. Silas didn't move a muscle. His breathing remained perfectly steady, a trick learned from years of hunting predators. Sterling tapped the paper. It was a newly printed sketch. She is 32 years old, heavy-set, broad-shouldered, dark hair, plain features, fled Boston last September. We tracked her stagecoach to this exact town last fall, right before the blizzards hit. Have you seen her? Jedediah looked at the poster, and his eyes darted involuntarily and disastrously straight towards Silas's broad back. Sterling was a professional. He caught the look instantly. He turned his gaze to the giant man standing quietly beside him. He looked at Silas's bearskin coat, the terrifying scar visible beneath the hat brim, and then his eyes fell upon the massive supply list Jedediah was filling. 50 lbs of flour, Sterling mused aloud, a cruel, knowing smile spreading across his face. 20 of sugar, calico lemon drops. That is a mighty domestic list for a lone mountain man. Silas turned his head slowly. He leveled his one piercing icy eye on the Pinkerton agent. I bake, Silas said, his voice a low, growly threat that made the shorter man reach for his shotgun. And I like lemon drops. Is there a law against it in this territory? Sterling chuckled, though his eyes remained dead and cold. No law against sugar, friend, but there is a federal law against harboring a fugitive wanted for stealing $40,000 in railroad bonds. The penalty is the hangman's noose. If you know where she is, I suggest you speak up. The bounty is $5,000. I don't know any women, Silas said flatly. He grabbed his supplies, throwing the massive sacks over his shoulders as they weighed nothing. Keep the change, Jedediah. Silas walked out of the store, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. As he loaded the wagon, he glanced back at the store window. Sterling was watching him, a predatory gleam in his eye. The winter was over. The hunt had begun. Silas did not take the main trail back to Dead Man's Ridge. He whipped the mules into a frenzied trot, driving the wagon into the freezing, swirling waters of the Little Bighorn River to hide his tracks, pushing the animals to the brink of exhaustion. He took the treacherous, crumbling path through Hangman's Creek, risking a broken axle to shave hours off his journey. He knew Sterling wouldn't follow him immediately. Pinkertons were meticulous. They would gather up posies, secure fresh horses, and wait for dawn to track the heavy wagon ruts. It was near midnight when Silas's wagon finally crashed into the clearing of the cabin. The mules were lathered in white sweat, their sides heaving. Silas leapt from the seat before it even rolled to a complete stop. "Clementine!" he bellowed, throwing the door open. She was standing by the stove, the shotgun already leveled at his chest. When she saw it was him, she lowered the weapon, but her relief vanished the moment she saw his face. His good eye was wide, feral, and panicked. "They're here," Silas said, breathing hard. "Pinkertons, a man named Sterling. They know you're up here. They'll be at the tree by mid-morning." Clementine's face drained of color, turning as white as her baking flour. The skillet in her hand clattered against the iron stove. "How many?" "Sterling, another agent. And likely a half-dozen hired guns from Oak Haven," Silas said, grabbing his Winchester from the wall and shoving handfuls of cartridges into his pockets. "We have to leave. I know a cave system a mile up the ridge. We can hide there until they give up and go back down." "They won't give up, Silas," Clementine whispered, her voice trembling for the first time since she had arrived. "Blackwood doesn't hire men who give up. If we run, they will burn this cabin to the ground. Everything we've built. They will destroy your home, and then they will hunt us until we starve in the snow." She looked around the cabin at the clean floors, the stocked pantry, the heavy cedar stool he had made for her. She looked at the man who had fought a grizzly and survived. A deep, terrifying resolve settled over her heavy features. "I have spent my entire life running from men who think they can take what is mine," Clementine said, picking up the shotgun and cracking the breech to check the shells. "I am not running from my own kitchen. We make our stand here." Silas looked at her. He saw the iron in her spine. A grim, dangerous smile touched his scarred lips. "All right, Mrs. Montgomery, we hold the ridge." They worked through the night in a frantic, synchronized rhythm. Silas boarded up the windows with heavy oak planks, leaving only narrow slits for his rifle barrel. Clementine dragged her heavy cedar trunk, the table, and the iron bed frame to barricade the heavy front door. She filled every bucket, pot, and kettle with water, knowing that fire was the boss weapon against a log cabin. By dawn, the cabin was a fortress. And then the waiting began. It was a torturous, agonizing silence, broken only by the dripping of melting snow from the sawed roof. The sun climbed high, casting long, deceiving shadows across the muddy clearing. At exactly 10 howled the blue jays in the pines suddenly went dead silent. "They're coming," Silas whispered, peering through the slit in the window boarding. 8 riders emerged from the dense timberline. They were heavily armed, their horses steaming in the crisp morning air. At the front was Agent Josiah Sterling, his charcoal suit traded for a heavy riding coat, a Winchester resting across his saddle. But it was the man riding beside Sterling that made Clementine gasp, a sound of pure, unadulterated horror escaping her throat. "No," she choked out, stepping back from her window slit, her thick hands flying to her mouth. "No, it can't be." Silas shifted his gaze. Beside Sterling was a small, pale man in a lavishly expensive but currently mud-spattered wool coat. He looked terrified, shivering in the saddle. But there was a distinct resemblance in the shape of his face, the set of his jaw. "Who is that?" Silas asked, his voice deadly quiet. "Thomas," Clementine whispered, tears of absolute betrayal welling in her eyes. "My brother." Sterling halted the posse at the edge of the clearing. Keeping a safe distance from the cabin's firing lines, he pulled a tin bullhorn from his saddlebag and raised it to his lips. Clementine Hughes, Sterling's voice echoed violently off the granite peaks. "We know you're in there. We have the mountains surrounded. Mr. Blackwood sends his regards." He also sent a familiar face to ensure a peaceful surrender. Thomas spurred his horse forward half a pace, his voice cracking as he yelled toward the barricaded cabin. "Clemmy, please. It's Thomas. Just come out. They promised they wouldn't hang you if you just sign the confession and give the money back. They just want the money." Clementine's sorrow instantly crystallized into blinding, white-hot rage. He was lying. He had stolen the money, spent it, and when Blackwood's men had caught him, he had led them straight to her to save his own miserable neck. He was the bloodhound. Silas looked at his wife. He saw the devastation followed quickly by the terrifying familiar fire he had seen the day she threatened him with the cast-iron skillet. "What do you want to do?" Silas asked calmly, resting the barrel of his Winchester on the wooden slit, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. Clementine wiped the tears from her face, leaving a smear of flour across her cheek. She picked up the double-barreled shotgun, walked to the front door, and looked at Silas. "Open the gun port," she commanded. Silas slid back a small square panel they had cut into the heavy oak door. Clementine leveled the shotgun through the hole, aiming it dead center at the posse. "Thomas," Clementine roared, her powerful voice booming across the clearing, silencing the wind itself. "You cowardly, thieving rat, you tell Didion Blackwood that Clementine Hughes is dead. She died in the snow. You are speaking to Clementine Montgomery, and if any man steps foot on my property, I will blow him straight to hell." Sterling's smile vanished. He realized too late that he wasn't dealing with a terrified, weeping city girl. He was dealing with a woman who had survived Dead Man's Ridge. "Burn them out," Sterling ordered coldly, signaling his men. The hired guns spurred their horses forward, pulling torches and kerosene flasks from their saddlebags. The Battle of Dead Man's Ridge had begun. Gunfire shattered the pristine morning silence of the Bitterroot Mountains. The first volley from Josiah Sterling's hired guns hammered into the front of the cabin, sounding like a furious hailstorm against the thick, unpeeled pine logs. Inside, the air instantly filled with floating dust and the sharp, acrid sting of splintered wood. Silas Montgomery didn't flinch. He stood perfectly still by the narrow window slit, his Winchester rifle resting on the wooden sill. He breathed in the smell of cordite and damp earth, letting the panicked rhythm of his own heart slow to the steady, cold beat of a hunter. He waited for the rapid, undisciplined firing from the posse to pause as the men levered fresh rounds into their chambers. "Now," Silas muttered to himself. He squeezed the trigger. The Winchester cracked, a single deafening retort inside the confined space of the cabin. Outside, a hired gun in a brown duster, who had been aggressively spurring his horse towards the porch, suddenly jerked backward, his shoulders shattered by the heavy lead slug. He fell from his saddle with a heavy thud, screaming as his panicked horse bolted into the dense pine trees. "Stay low, Clementine," Silas roared over his shoulder, rapidly working the lever of his rifle. He fired twice more, sending the rest of the charging riders scrambling for the cover of the massive granite boulders that littered the edge of the clearing. Clementine was crouched beneath the heavy oak table she had dragged against the front door. She wasn't weeping. Her heavy chest heaved with exertion and adrenaline, her thick hands gripping the double-barreled shotgun until her knuckles turned bone white. She had spent her life measuring flour, kneading dough, and balancing ledger books in a cramped Boston bakery. She had never fired a weapon at a living creature. But as bullets tore through the shingles of the roof above her, she felt a primal territorial rage surge through her veins. This was her home. "They're moving around the flanks," Silas shouted, his good eyes scanning the tree. "They know the logs are too thick to shoot through. They're going to try and burn us out from the blind spots." As if on cue, a glass flask filled with kerosene shattered against the heavy wooden shutters of the kitchen window. A second later, a flaming torch was hurled through the air, landing in the puddle of fuel. Orange flames instantly roared to life, licking hungrily at the wood. Clementine didn't hesitate. She dropped her shotgun, grabbed the heavy iron bucket of water she had drawn from the creek that morning, and hauled it towards the window. "Silas, open the shutter," she yelled. Silas unlatched the heavy iron hook and kicked the shutter outward. Clementine heaved the bucket, sending a torrential wave of water crashing against the flames. The fire hissed and died in a violent cloud of black, greasy smoke. But the muntry opening was exactly what the Pinkerton agent had been waiting for. A bullet whipped through the open window, burying itself deep into the stone mortar of the fireplace, inches from Clementine's head. Silas slammed the shutter closed, grabbing Clementine by her heavy wool skirt and pulling her down to the dirt floor. "Are you hit?" Silas demanded, his massive hands frantically checking her shoulders and head. "I'm whole," Clementine gasped, brushing the dirt from her face. She looked up at his scarred, terrifying visage, seeing only the raw, desperate fear in his one good eye. He wasn't afraid of dying. He was terrified of losing her. "Silas," a voice called out from the back of the cabin. It wasn't the booming, authoritative shout of Agent Sterling. It was a thin, greedy, desperate voice. It was coming from the root cellar door just on the other side of the kitchen wall. "Clemmy, are you there?" Clementine's blood ran cold. She crawled across the floor, pressing her back against the log wall near the cellar door. "Thomas," she spat, the name tasting like poison on her tongue. "You brought murderers to my doorstep." "I had to, Clem," Thomas pleaded through the heavy timber. His voice was shrill, breaking with panic. "Blackwood found me in Denver. He broke 2 of my fingers, Clemmy. He was going to kill me. He doesn't even care about the railroad bonds anymore. The company is bankrupt. He needs the life insurance." Clementine froze, her thick fingers digging into the dirt floor. "What life insurance? I took out a policy on you in Boston." Thomas sobbed through the wood. $10,000 payable to me in the event of your untimely demise. I signed it over to Blackwood to pay my debts. They just need you dead, Clemmy, and they'll let me walk away. Just come out. They'll do it quick. If you make them fight, they'll torture you. They'll kill the mountain man, too." The sheer, breathtaking depravity of her own flesh and blood washed over Clementine like a bucket of freezing river water. He had just framed her. He had commodified her death. To Thomas, she wasn't a sister. She was a slaughter pig fattened and sold to clear his gambling debts. A terrifying, unnatural calm settled over Clementine's broad features. She slowly picked up her shotgun and cracked the breech, ensuring both brass shells were loaded. "Thomas," Clementine said, her voice dropping to a low, resonant register that echoed with finality. "Do you remember when our father died and I spent 5 years working a 14-hour shift at the bakery to pay for your schooling? Clemmy, please. Do you remember when you caught typhus and I sat by your bed for 2 weeks, bathing your fever when the doctors said you were a corpse?" "I had no choice," Thomas wailed, pounding his fist against the exterior of the door. "Stand back from the door, Thomas," Clementine ordered flatly. "What? Clemmy, are you opening it?" Clementine leveled the shotgun at chest height, aiming directly at the center of the wooden planks where her brother's voice was vibrating. She didn't blink. She pulled both triggers simultaneously. The double blast in the enclosed cabin was earth-shattering. A massive hole erupted through the heavy oak door, sending a lethal spray of buckshot and splintered wood blasting out onto the back porch. A shrill, agonizing scream pierced the air outside, followed by the sound of someone scrambling backward in the mud, sobbing in terror. She hadn't killed him. The angle was deliberately low, shredding the wood to send a barrage of splinters into his legs. But she had delivered her final verdict. "You are no brother of mine." Clementine roared through the smoking, jagged hole in the door. "The next one goes through your teeth." Silas stared at his wife, his jaw slightly slack. The soft, doughy woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in Oak Haven was gone entirely. In her place stood a matriarch of the frontier, forged in iron and baking flour, fiercely defending her territory. "They're regrouping," Silas said, snapping out of his oar as he checked his rifle magazine. "Sterling knows we're dug in. He's going to wait for nightfall. Once it's dark, they'll surround the cabin and torch the roof simultaneously. We can't put out a fire from all four sides." Clementine reloaded her shotgun, her hands completely steady now. "Then we don't wait for nightfall." "What do we do, Silas?" Silas looked down at the dirt floor. He walked over to the heavy braided rug that sat in front of the hearth and kicked it aside. Beneath it were heavy iron-ringed floorboards. "Dead Man's Ridge got its name for a reason, Clementine," Silas said softly. "Before I built this cabin, an old fur trapper lived on this plot. He dug a drainage tunnel that runs from the root cellar under the clearing and empties out into the heavy brush near the ravine. It's narrow, muddy, and it smells like a grave, but it puts a man right behind the boulder line where Sterling's men are hiding." Clementine looked at the trap door, then up at Silas's massive, broad-shouldered frame. "You barely fit." "I'll fit," Silas said, pulling his long, wicked hunting knife from its leather sheath. He checked the cylinder of his Colt revolver and shoved it into his belt. "You keep firing from the window. Make them think we're both still in here. Shoot at anything that moves. Give me 20 minutes. Clementine grabbed his thick, calloused hand before he could open the trap door. She pulled him down slightly, her dark eyes locking onto his solitary, fierce blue one. "You come back to my kitchen, Silas Montgomery," she whispered fiercely, "or I will march down into hell and drag you back by your beard." A genuine warm smile cracked the scarred ruin of Silas's face. He leaned forward and pressed his forehead against hers. It was a brief, profound moment of absolute devotion amidst the scent of gunpowder and blood. "Yes, Mom," Silas murmured. He opened the trap door and vanished into the dark, muddy earth below. The freezing mud of the drainage tunnel clung to Silas like wet cement as he dragged his massive frame forward. Above him, the rhythmic, thunderous boom of Clementine's shotgun kept Agent Sterling's men pinned, drawing all their fire to the front of the cabin. Pushing through a thick tangle of dead brambles, Silas emerged at the edge of the ravine, 50 yards behind the Pinkerton Posey's flank. Here in the dense timber and deep shadows, he wasn't a man defending a cabin. He was the apex predator of the Bitterroot. He moved with terrifying silence. The first hired gun, reloading behind a deadfall, never saw the heavy pommel of Silas's hunting knife strike the base of his skull. Silas dragged his limp body into the brush. Moving up the line, he found 2 more men huddled near the tethered horses. He stepped from the shadows, grabbed them by the scruffs of their heavy coats, and slammed their heads together with the force of a falling anvil. They dropped instantly. "Mila Davis!" Josiah Sterling shouted, crouching behind a granite boulder. He turned, his cultured demeanor cracking as he stared into the oppressive wall of trees. As his 2 remaining thugs moved to check the flank, Silas dropped from the low-hanging branches of a cedar tree right between them. A punishing right hook shattered the jaw of the first. A violent twist of a rifle barrel disarmed the second before Silas drove the heavy wooden stock into the man's sternum. Josiah Sterling was suddenly entirely alone. He backed up against the cold granite, his revolver trembling as the giant mud-caked mountain man stepped into the clearing. "Stay back," Sterling screamed. "I am an agent of the Pinkertons. I have federal authority. Your authority ends at the tree, city boy." Silas growled, his voice a terrifying rumble. Sterling cocked the hammer. "I'll put a bullet right between your eyes." Before Sterling could pull the trigger, the ruined oak door of the cabin swung violently open. "Agent Sterling," a voice boomed. Sterling flinched, turning to see Clementine standing on the porch completely exposed, a shotgun leveled at his chest. In that split second of distraction, Silas lunged. He crossed the distance in 3 massive strides, grabbing Sterling's gun hand and twisting it violently. The revolver fired uselessly into the sky as Silas drove his knee into Sterling's ribs. The agent collapsed into the mud, gasping for air. Silas hauled Sterling up by the lapels of his ruined suit. "You tell Gideon Blackwood," Silas rasped, "that if he ever sends men up this mountain again, I will come to Chicago and tear him apart with my bare hands. Now take your men and get off my land." As the battered posse frantically scrambled to their horses, Clementine walked slowly down the porch stairs. She ignored the fleeing Pinkertons and rounded the side of the cabin. Thomas was sitting in the mud, clutching his splinter-shredded legs and shivering uncontrollably. "Clemmy, I'm sorry," he wept, looking up at his sister's imposing silhouette. Clementine felt no pity. She only felt a profound, heavy emptiness. "Take off your coat, Thomas," she commanded softly. Thomas blinked. "What, Clemmy?" "It's freezing. Take off the coat and your boots," she repeated, leveling the smoking shotgun at his face. Sobbing hysterically, Thomas stripped off his expensive wool coat and unlaced his leather boots. He sat in his stocking feet, his teeth chattering violently in the biting spring air. "Sterling is leaving," Clementine said, pointing down the treacherous mountain trail. "You can try to catch up to his horses, or you can walk. But if I ever see your face again, Thomas, I will not aim for the door." Turning her back on his wailing, she walked to the front of the cabin, carrying his coat and boots. She tossed them onto the woodpile. The silence of the mountains slowly returned. Silas stood by the porch, watching the woman who had just defended their home. Her plain brown dress was torn, her hands black with soot and gunpowder. To the mountain man, she was the most breathtaking sight on earth. He reached out, his massive, calloused hand gently brushing a streak of soot from her flushed cheek. Clementine leaned into his heavy, comforting touch, the adrenaline fading into a bone-deep exhaustion replaced by an unshakable peace. "The roof needs patching," Clementine whispered, looking up at his solitary, fierce blue eye. "And the front door is completely ruined." Silas smiled, the jagged scar on his face pulling tight. "I have plenty of wood, Mrs. Montgomery." "Good," Clementine said, her hand resting over his, "because I intend to stay a very long time, and I still need to finish baking the bread." The legend of the fearsome mountain man of Dead Man's Ridge evolved over the years, traded in hushed tones in the saloons of Oak Haven. They no longer spoke of a bloodthirsty ghost. They spoke of the impenetrable fortress, guarded by a giant and his formidable baker wife. Gideon Blackwood was indicted for fraud 2 years later, dying penniless in a federal penitentiary. His bounty on Clementine forgotten, Thomas Hughes was never seen again, swallowed whole by the unforgiving Wyoming wilderness. Silas and Clementine Montgomery never returned to the east. They remained on their ridge, expanding the cabin, their bond forged in gunpowder, surviving the harshest winters and proving that the strongest love isn't found in polite society, but built with calloused hands, fierce loyalty, and a refusal to ever run.